Good morning. So just very few words about my person. I was trained as a forest scientist, but later made a second degree in landscape ecology. Have spent a few years at the landscape planning department in Copenhagen in Denmark, and have for the past 5 years now been with the University of Göttingen and the University of Kassel in Germany, where I'm a professor of social ecological interactions, mainly working on agricultural themes, but with an interest also in the linkages to other land use and natural resource management sectors such as forestry, nature conservation, urban planning, and so on. My talk will take you geographically to Europe. It was interesting to see already some German examples in the previous presentation, but maybe more importantly, it will also take us a bit away from the urban regions that have been at the center of the previous two discussions, and towards rural areas, where maybe the concept of green infrastructure is a bit more difficult to apply, as there are many green spaces obviously in rural areas, and the question is more what types of green spaces, what types of agricultural and forest uses are really benefiting human well-being. Therefore, my talk will be centered around the concept of cultural ecosystem services. I want to go into two questions, basically. First, introducing you to this concept and ask, why do cultural ecosystem services actually matter for human well-being? And the second, more science-oriented question is, how can cultural ecosystem services actually be assessed? And I will try to highlight that with two empirical case studies that we performed with colleagues at the level of Europe. Cultural ecosystem services as a concept have become widely known or introduced as a term with the release of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. You see here an early definition that specifies cultural services as all non-material benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, and a range of examples of such non-material benefits is actually given, ranging from spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, reflection, recreation, and its aesthetic experiences, knowledge systems, social relations, aesthetic values, and so on and so forth. You see the 6 main categories that have been taken up in the first Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework, and that are, I think, until today at the very center of the debates on cultural services. Recreation, the last point, plays a central role, maybe also a bit special role until today, but also aesthetic appreciation, inspiration, spiritual services, and so forth. The reason why cultural ecosystem services have been framed so prominently in this and other assessments is that it is assumed that human well-being critically depends on cultural ecosystem services, and that an assessment and acknowledgement of this class of ecosystem services would lead to a more sustainable management of land or ecosystems. I have to say that cultural ecosystem services for me is a fascinating but also a complex or complicated concept. As you know, just for illustration, on the left side you see one of many concepts of the notion of ecosystem services. You see that this is actually a very simplified loop. You see ecosystems on the one side, human systems or social systems on the other sides, and well, ecosystem services are provided in a unidirectional way from ecosystems where they are generated to the human systems where they are being consumed or used. In turn, the loop is being closed by certain management interventions, actions by land use, where human systems in turn influence ecosystem services. Quite simple picture. If you look at on the right side, and I will not go into each of the boxes and flows between the boxes. I use that just for illustration, that the generation of cultural ecosystem services is way more complicated than depicted in this simplified graph on the left. because all these different components, the environmental aspects, the biophysical domain, cultural practices, and so on, are interlinked in multiple terms, so that some people have argued actually cultural services would be better called socio-ecological services than only ecosystem services, as they are co-produced together by people and nature over time. So why do cultural services matter? Many of you will know this graph that is again borrowed from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The Millennium Assessment was a number of thick reports that try to elicit the relationship between ecosystems and human well-being in all its complexities. You see many arrows. What I just want to take out of this complex graph is that there are multiple ways how ecosystems are connected to human well-being. The thickness of the arrows indicates the strength of the relationship. And you immediately notice that there are many strong relationships assumed between the provisioning services, the material services such as food production, provision of drinking water, and so on, to different constituents of human well-being. Also, the ecosystem processes that provide regulating ecosystem services, protection against floods, and so on. We have heard a lot about that in the previous presentations today. Also present many strong relationships to aspects of human well-being, whereas the cultural ecosystem services are characterized by relatively weak connections to human well-being, which I think is also somehow intuitive and makes sense if you think about the classical Maslow pyramid, for example, of human needs, that assumes that the pillars of human needs are the basic functions, the basic materials for good life, to live in a safe environment, and that aspects of social relations, of cultural values, and so on, are more at the top of human needs. However, and that is again from the Millennium Assessment, if you look at another aspect of the relationship between ecosystems and human well-being, the picture changes a little bit, and the importance of cultural services may get a little bit clearer. Here, the different colors indicate the mediation potential through socioeconomic factors, and that is often a term that I find a little bit technical and difficult to understand. What the Millennium Assessment wanted to say by that is kind of the replaceability of ecosystem services. And you see that especially the provisioning services have green arrows, which means that if some provisioning services are degrading locally, if, for example, there is no clean drinking water available in an area, it is possible to replace that service by technical means. You can, if you have the financial resources, simply buy and ship in water from other places. You can do that to, well, a medium degree also with some of the regulating services, but, and that's the characteristic of the cultural services, you see a lot of red in these arrows, flowing from cultural services to human well-being. Most of the cultural ecosystem services actually cannot be simply replaced by technical means. You cannot replace the spiritual value of a forest. You cannot replace the sense of place of the region where you have grown up by other things. To fill this assumption of the Millennium Assessment with a little bit of empirical material, here's some social survey that we carried out with colleagues from Freiburg University in Germany and Bochum University of Vienna in Austria some years ago in 4 places in Central Europe, where we openly asked people a question, how they perceive the link between their local landscapes and their own well-being. That was a complex survey, and I will just go to the most important insights. What we found is we later tried to classify these open answers that we got on all aspects of ecosystems and landscapes through the lens of the ecosystem services framework. What we found out was that I think around 70% of the responses related to ecosystem services fell into the class of cultural ecosystem services. So that really plays an outstanding role in the perception of people's human well-being. Especially practices and experiences were considered to be quite formative for well-being as perceived by people. On this graph on the left side, you see a few examples from the different places, always depending on the local landscape context. Of course, you see that in mountain areas like the southern German Black Forest, hiking, walking, cycling, jogging, all these typical outdoor recreational activities are of paramount importance. And that was quite similar also for other places. So we concluded that on the one hand, the material quality, the physical quality of an ecosystem service matters, of course, to foster cultural ecosystem services, but according to our results in that study, maybe even more, fostering possibilities, opportunities for active engagement with ecosystem services is also paramount, which means that issues like the accessibility of landscape need to be considered maybe more than previously done. In another overview, we also discussed or explored in a bit more depth the role of how cultural ecosystem services matter as motivators for certain types of managing land, owning land, conserving land and landscapes, or planning for land and landscapes. Through a review of the literature, we found or identified 3 pathways of how cultural ecosystem services modify land ownership and management. First, on the top here, in many places of the world, cultural services have become an important driver of the decision-making of landowners. If you think, for example, about forest and rangeland owners in the North American West, in California, where that has been quite well investigated, typically cultural ecosystem services motivations lead landowners to manage their lands in a more multifunctional way compared to landowners who are more traditionally interested in timber production or other forms of resource extraction. However, often it has also been found that it may lead to a more passive land management, that people just let their land develop by itself, which may not always be beneficial for the multifunctionality of ecosystem services provision. And we also found out that cultural ecosystem services as a driver of land management provides quite a few new challenges for agricultural and forestry extension services, and that these are often not prepared for such new motives for managing land. At the level of local communities, cultural ecosystem services often motivate people which can find expression in outdoor recreation, ecotourism, in self-organized cultural practices. There's a big hype of gathering mushrooms, berries, foraging in urban parks, in rural environments, and so on. Sometimes that also leads to some kind of collective form of regional level landscape stewardship, something that we observe in Germany, for example, often in our UNESCO biosphere reserves. Finally, the world of landscape planning has also been quite influenced by the rise of cultural ecosystem services and led to new ways of eliciting actually the landscape values as appreciated by multiple parts of society, by better understanding the synergies of trade-offs, by the cultural use of people with biodiversity and ecosystem services as measured in, for example, biophysical terms. Yeah, given that importance, that also the Millennium Assessment dedicated to cultural services, it has been in the early stages of ecosystem services actually been a bit surprising that there was very little knowledge and very little research carried out on assessing them. This table is also from the Millennium Assessment, and I show that just, yeah, if you compare that to the tables of how the Millennium Assessment assessed provisioning ecosystem services or regulating ecosystem services, were filled with numbers and information. Here you see a lot of NA, which means data not available, so that the Millennium Assessment at the same time was emphasizing the strong importance of cultural services, but had to admit that actually we know very, very little about most of the cultural ecosystem services. And for those where some information was available, that was actually very scant information. If you look at the class of spiritual and religious values, for example, I think the only type of spiritual values or cases that have been presented in the report were the sacred groves in so forests dedicated to some spiritual or religious purposes in a small number of world areas. That has fortunately changed. You see here some review of the literature on cultural service until 2015, and this trend has continued also until today, that from around the year 2010 onwards, actually a quite lively research community has developed around cultural ecosystem services, so that now we know a lot more about them than we used to do 10 years ago. There has also been a lot of methods development that is sometimes quite complex. I will present some methods a little bit later that I applied myself. I find this graph useful for making sense and classifying a little bit the diversity of innovative approaches that are being developed. This graph has actually 3 different axes, and you can classify methods, for example, by a focus more on the individual preferences, on assessing more the individual level or the social preferences. Typically, yeah, these methods on the left side would ask people individually about their ecosystem services perceptions, where at the right side that would be more deliberative exercises in focus group or other contexts. You see another axis, self-oriented at one and others-oriented at the other hand. What are you actually assessing? Are you assessing the self-perceived human well-being, or are you assessing how people perceive the contribution of an ecosystem to overall well-being at the level of larger society? And of course, there are many quantitative and also qualitative, spatially explicit methods, and so on. So now I will follow with a few examples from Europe, as I announced already. One where we used the method of PPGIS, public participation GIS. The other one, a quantitative social survey of with the purpose for understanding a bit better how cultural ecosystem services are actually perceived and used in the context of European landscapes. Both studies were performed within 2 European projects. One more with the interest of using agroforestry for integrated rural development in Europe. The other one more with the motivation to introduce and to study innovative mechanisms to foster multiple forest ecosystem services in Europe. So in this first study, we did what many European collaborative projects are doing. We set up a network of, in total, 13, I think, study sites depicting the whole diversity, the whole biogeographical diversity of the European continent, carried out surveys in each of these places, and then performed a comparison across these sites, motivated by an improved understanding for the linkages between different ecosystem services as they have been perceived by different actors and in different types of rural landscapes. Here you see a little bit an example of how public participation GIS works. For those who are not familiar with participatory mapping methods, a very booming field. To put it simply, it's kind of a mix of a traditional social survey with a especially explicit GIS component. You ask people about the values that they attach to land, or the ways or types of how they use land, and people would give their responses and place some dots on a map, as you see in this example from one of our Spanish study areas. You also see the ecosystem services that we had been interested in. You see that our focus in this study was mainly on cultural ecosystem services like social interactions, aesthetic values, cultural heritage values, and so on. a quick overview of some of the key results that we got from this or maybe not but European comparison. Not much different from other similar surveys. We found outdoor recreation, aesthetic values, and social relations or interactions taking place in rural landscapes to be the values that had been most prominently mentioned by local people. People have been able to map quite a large number of places that they appreciate for different ecosystem services in their local landscapes. An interesting difference that we identified when comparing between the European regions was that people highlighted the importance of provisioning ecosystem services, especially the function of rural landscapes to produce agricultural goods or commodities, that was more emphasized in regions with a low gross domestic product and a relatively low population density, especially in the Mediterranean and eastern parts of Europe, also in these areas where a relatively large part of the population is still working in agriculture. In contrast, in the central and northern parts of Europe, we found that the cultural services were much more appreciated, and that in our interpretation was related with a higher GDP and also higher population densities. We also did quite a number of spatial analyses of our results, and I will not go into many details. Some key results, some key insights that we found was that the mean distance between where people live and where certain ecosystem services are perceived and used plays a role. There are some types of ecosystem services like places dedicated to farm products or to harvesting wild resources. Outdoor recreation activities are typically practiced very close to the living places of people, but then there are other ecosystem services like habitat biodiversity values and aesthetic values that are appreciated in the places that are furthest away from people home. So we assume that maybe these more unusual landscapes that people are not experiencing every day, that have less built structures, also have a certain attractiveness in terms of certain ecosystem services. We also studied how clustered or randomly dispersed different places mapped by people have been in the landscape. We found that some ecosystem services, especially cultural heritage value, but also the places where local farm commodities are being produced, occur in very clustered forms, which makes it easier to, in spatial planning, for example, to protect these values. But you see also that the majority of ecosystem services is actually quite dispersed in the landscape, which calls for really a planning and management at the landscape scale of ecosystem services. We tried and worked hard to identify or to relate perceptions of ecosystem services with socio-demographic characteristics of respondents. To make a long story short, we did not find many clear relationships to the classical factors such as gender, age, education, income, and so on. But what we found out relatively clearly was a pattern that appreciation for ecosystem services was higher among those people who are owning land or using land through agriculture or forestry, and also among people who specified that they would know their area relatively well and that they have lived in the area for a long term. So engaging closely with land through land use or for just having lived in the area for a long time obviously increases the appreciation of ecosystem services. We also worked hard to relate, to find some relation between the map places and certain landscape or land cover characteristics. We did not find many clear patterns. Maybe the reality of European landscapes is too diverse to find some clear patterns. But what came out was that accessibility, again, the possibility of finding access to land through a network of trails, for example, was actually the most significant predictor that we found in relation to these characteristics. We also found a little bit a weaker pattern that mosaic landscapes that are characterized by a certain richness of different types of land cover, were more favored by people than landscapes that are structured more homogeneously. Now coming to a second example, an example that was dedicated to European forests, a collaboration with a non-academic partner, the European Landowners Organization, ELO, who offered us access to their network of members. Here in a survey, we were interested in assessing the use of cultural ecosystem services in European forests, and also the willingness of forest owners to further capitalize on cultural ecosystem services. We then also want to go into identifying trade-offs and synergies perceived by the people owning and managing forests in relation to cultural ecosystem service uses, to categorize different groups of forest owners in that regard, and also to uncover the barriers and limitations of a better or more intensified use of cultural ecosystem services in forests. That was done through a European-wide online survey. I said already, the European Landowners Organization facilitated access to private forest owners and managers. We had performed the survey in 20 different European languages. We had asked a total of 16 questions, and we're happy to receive a relatively high number of more than 1,000 valid surveys that we then analyzed through a mix of different analytical methods. So you see here the cultural ecosystem services that are actually used in European forests differ a little bit from what I presented you in the previous exercise. You see here that hunting, which you could classify in the European context as maybe a mix. It's provisioning ecosystem services, you could say, as long as you eat the game that you are hunting, but also a cultural, a recreational use. That is by far the most important cultural ecosystem service used in European forests. But you also see that research, harvesting of wild products, farming, actually a diversity of different uses all play a role in European forests. But you see also that a few activities are standing out where the potential in light gray is actually higher than the current use in the perception of forest owners, such as artistic activities, recreational fishing, provisioning of accommodation for tourists, and so on. So that maybe points to some pathways for further development of cultural services, also as an economic activity for forest owners and managers. When we went in our analysis into assessing synergies and trade-offs, we found, like what is often found in studies of CES, that there are many synergies, perhaps also because the boundaries between many cultural services are a bit blurry. It's for people difficult maybe to distinguish clearly between the sense of place of an area or the social relations or the heritage values of an area, and so forth. However, what we found was also a number of trade-offs, especially to those ecosystem services uses related to some kind of resource extraction like hunting and farming, but also to some recreational uses, the provision of accommodation for tourists and recreational fishing. That is something that I think, especially in the course of the COVID pandemic, that led in Europe, probably like in Asia, to a much more intensified recreational use of forests that has intensified. And here you see a few quotes of forest owners and management that are actually complaining about how movements of people, of dog owners and their animals, for example, are actually disturbing other uses and purposes of their forests. So maybe linking to my previous slide on how cultural ecosystem services can motivate some uses and some forms of management that may be beneficial for the multifunctionality of forests, for biodiversity and so on. What we may conclude is that obviously there are also boundaries for cultural ecosystem services uses, and that there is also the not only the possibility, but also the finding that in many of Europe's forests, we also find some type of overuse of cultural services. Here are a few pictures on our clustering of different types of forest owners. That is actually a relatively simple exercise that we carried out. We found 4 different groups of forest owners. Group 1 is the one that actually is making use already now of a diversity of cultural services, and that is interested and sees a number of additional uses of cultural services for the future. Group 2 is the opposite, makes very little use of cultural services currently and does not see a great potential, has a negative attitude to further making use of cultural services. Group 3 and 4 are a little bit in between, makes a medium use of cultural services. One group is more positive, the other more negative in the assessment of potential uses of cultural services in the future. Based on this categorization, we try to identify different types of strategy of how to make a better use of cultural services in these different forest types. Group 1 in the bottom right again, here innovate, fostering innovation, innovative mechanisms, innovative types of cultural ecosystem service use is the strategy we propose, whereas the opposite group, the green type, needs some basic stimulation through awareness raising, promotion of the importance and the potential of diverse ecosystem services, maybe also simply better economic incentives. And for the remaining medium groups, maintaining those ecosystem services that are provided, and maybe through political support and recognition, but also facilitating for this other group by reducing, for example, bureaucratic hurdles and so on, was a strategy that we recommended. I'm not completely sure how I'm doing in time, but I think I have a few minutes left. If not, Rio, please remind me, but I'm already at my last slides after these 2 European case examples to ask maybe a bit more generally why actually we should integrate cultural services into assessments of ecosystem services, because as I said, cultural services are a little bit special. They do not fit so nicely into the models developed in ecosystem service science, the cascade models and so on. So that actually in some debates, some people have even proposed to delete cultural services as a category from the list of ecosystem services, because they are not purely provided by ecosystems, because they are so complicated and so on. However, I would strongly argue against that. I would argue that cultural services can help avoid biases towards other ecosystem services, can avoid trade-offs that may be unwanted in land management. If you don't measure something, then often it's not seen and not taken up in policy and planning. Cultural services, in my view, can also help for a more precise understanding of ecosystem services, how they are perceived by a diversity of stakeholders and user groups. They also improve the understanding of this complicated link between ecosystems and human well-being. They introduce perception perspectives in the debate on multifunctionality of land use. And I will skip, in the interest of time, the remaining arguments. Just want to highlight that it's not an uncontested concept. And here is one of the most radical papers, maybe, that called also for abandoning the concept of cultural ecosystem services, as indeed in terms of terminology, you could from a cultural perspective ask many questions. For example, if ecosystem is the right term, if that is the level and the object that is really at the center of people when they think about landscapes. Similarly, services has a certain economic connotation that may be difficult. But still, cultural ecosystem services is the term that has survived until today. Some people prefer talking about relational values, non-material contributions of nature to people, which resolves some of these difficulties, but sometimes introduces new difficulties. So I will end my presentation also pointing some of the challenges. I think I mentioned them more or less already in the course of my talk. Definitions are sometimes vague and a bit difficult. CES are co-produced by people. There are difficulties to quantify them economically, biophysically. They are normative in nature. My point is these are all valid points, but actually many of these challenges do not apply only to cultural services, but also to provisioning services, to regulating services. The people in the biophysical world and partly also in the economic sciences maybe just waste a little bit less time on highlighting these challenges compared to those in the socio-cultural world of cultural ecosystem services. By that, some last selling points of why I consider cultural ecosystem services a vibrant field of research and of high policy interest, just maybe to offer some arguments for our later discussion. Thank you so much for your attention.